Hello there, my name is Holly Smith, and I'm the Project Archivist for the Women's Aid Federation of England Archive, which is held up in the University of Leeds Special Collections. I'm currently taking part in a professional fellowship in partnership with the National Archives and Research Libraries UK, and for this I've chosen to research inclusive cataloguing practice, namely the balancing of representation and accessibility. The Women's Aid Archive has provided me with a great case study for my research. As I'm sure you're all aware, women's voices are often pretty absent in traditional archive settings. So this makes this archive quite a rarity. Its records are inspired, created, and used by women, and my fellowship has allowed me time to focus on this and how I can really do it justice. For this Cataloguing Week chat, I want to talk to you about some of the things I've been doing as I've been cataloguing the Women's Aid Archive, things that really champion the idea of inclusive cataloguing. Because I'm not here for very long, I'm going to focus in on three main areas: how we're using engagement to inform our cataloguing, our approaches to language in the archive, and finally touching on our work around trauma-informed practice. I believe these three areas play into that balance of inclusive cataloguing, wanting to really bring across that representation in catalogue descriptions, but also making sure we're making our material as accessible and welcoming as possible. But first, a brief introduction to our archive. I would like to flag at this stage that Women's Aid is a domestic abuse charity and that our archive interacts with various sensitive issues surrounding this topic. I won't be overtly mentioning details of domestic abuse during this presentation, but I will still share some details at the end of the presentation for anyone that might feel affected. So Women's Aid is a domestic abuse charity that works as a national coordinating body for local domestic abuse services. It provides information, training and resources, as well as lobbying and campaigning for women's rights and legislative change. Women's Aid has been at the forefront of the refuge movement for almost half a century, celebrating its 50th anniversary in 2024. Women's Aid emerged out of activism surrounding the women's liberation movement, and were back then known as the National Women's Aid Federation, or NWAF. They were initially seen as radical activists, raising awareness of taboo subjects such as domestic abuse and gendered violence. But our archive tells an incredible narrative of perseverance and progress. In the span of just 20 years, Women's Aid transformed from an organisation met with scepticism and aggression to one that was highly respected for its original research and expertise. It's a rich and complex history, covering not only the history of domestic abuse movement, but the history of women's liberation, refuges, social history, legal history, and much more. And I wanted to really ensure I was representing that in the catalogue. So one way we did this was accepting that we as archivists aren't subject specialists. We don't own this history, which brings me on really nicely to the topic of engagement. I wanted to build relationships with the groups represented in our archive. So for us, the main contender here was Women's Aid themselves. We wanted the Women's Aid archive to authentically represent the functionality of their organisation. So I made sure to have Women's Aid representatives provide feedback on things like our collection structure, runs of documents, and key names that crop up. It's small interventions, but in doing so, we ensured a more accurate representation of Women's Aid's voice. The projects also benefited from a close communication with Feminist Archive North, whose collections are also housed within the Uni of Leeds Special Collections. Feminist Archive North, also known as FAN, is entirely run by volunteers, a lot of whom were involved in the activism of the women's liberation movement. So this makes FAN a really great group for engaging with, as for a lot of them, this is their story. I found it really valuable to share the material we're working on with them, as their expertise and personal experience is invaluable. For example, if you look at the items on the screen here, they all relate to a march in Birmingham that happened in 1979, but we really had very little information on what this march was about. When we showed it to FAN, they were able to tell us that at that time Birmingham was the only large city that didn't have a refuge. A local group even went as far as to squat in a house, but the council still didn't cave. So Women's Aid organised a massive national demonstration in Birmingham and had coaches bring women to protest from all over the country. Not long after, Birmingham Council agreed and a refuge was set up. So it's this kind of feedback that really shows the level of personal detail and presents the kind of information that can't really be gained through a simple Google search. It highlights perfectly how engagement with relevant groups can really enrich our understanding and documentation of a collection. I now wanted to move on to discuss language in the Women's Aid Archive. Our archive is not without its fair share of historic terminology. One of the main examples we come across is the term battered wives, which we can see here on the slides. So this was actually used by Women's Aid themselves in the 70s and 80s, which makes it a really interesting case study. It's this kind of sensitive language that has the potential to cause offence and be triggering to certain individuals, but it also represents an important part of domestic abuse history. It probably isn't a term that modern day audiences would use to search with, but historians in this field probably would. It's this tricky balance that provides a key debate for my research, wanting to achieve that appropriate representation of the history, but also wanting to keep language as inclusive as possible. In the past, I've conducted research around offensive language in order to write up workflows for our existing catalogues in special collections. So this produced three main approaches. If the term has been used by the original creator and represents an important aspect of the record, this language should be maintained. If the term was not present in the original record and instead came from a curatorial voice, but still describes an important aspect of the record, this language should be replaced but with an equally meaningful and accurate term. If the language came from a curatorial voice but is also irrelevant to the original record, in these cases the language can be safely removed. But it's also worth saying, as a bit of a caveat to these, that the edits will be tracked and the legacy descriptions will be saved. When dealing with the Women's Aid Archive, which is in the process of being catalogued, it's only this first option we need to be aware of, but I've included the other approaches as they serve as a reminder for the unconscious bias an archivist can bring to cataloguing, which is something we should always keep at the forefront of our minds when doing the cataloguing process. It's also worth mentioning the nuances around appropriate language. It's hard, if not impossible, to find a term that everyone agrees to feel represented by. And even if you do, there's no telling when it will fall out of use and be replaced by another. It's therefore important to thoroughly research language by reaching out to communities, like previously mentioned. For example, through chats with Women's Aid, I learned that victim survivor is the most widely accepted term at the moment. And the one they currently use is the one that women in refuges feel most likely to be represented by. But it's also important to understand that this might change, and to write into our archive policies that language should be reviewed periodically going forward. So my third and final pit stop on this tour is trauma-informed practice. As you can tell from basically everything I've said previously, Women's Aid is an archive that deals with a lot of potentially triggering subjects. Here on this slide and on the one I've shown previously, we can see some relatively low-level examples that come from posters and postcards that were readily made available to the public. But even in these cases, we've seen examples of historic language such as battered wives and really emotive references to violence. It's only when we came to discuss our volunteer programme, that we really took a step back and realised we needed to set up guidelines and measures to ensure the well-being of people interacting with the archive. So we began to research trauma-informed practice. This is a growing recognition of the impact trauma can have on people, particularly being aware of the symptoms of vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue, such as desensitization, apathy, and burnout, and how they can present themselves in people in a number of different ways. In the archive world, it's relevant because we often deal with very personal and emotive historic material. The popularity of the Trauma-Informed Archives Community of Practice group is testament to this. On their online forum, they regularly discuss case studies of secondary trauma in archives, emotional responses to records, and the emotional labour of archivists. Their resources have been incredibly valuable to us, and I'd recommend taking a look yourselves. So after this research and a bit of networking with similar organisations, we came up with two main outputs for our projects: a volunteer handbook and a volunteer management checklist. The volunteer handbook goes over the type of material volunteers might come across during their projects. It informs on vicarious trauma, it shares relevant resources, and it explains how they can manage their own approach to dealing with sensitive material. The volunteer management checklist outlines what should be done by us before, during, and after a volunteer project to ensure this duty of care to our volunteers. It includes things like an introductory tour of the archive, being aware of triggers and how everyone's different, and having set breaks. So we made sure to go for a coffee break each volunteer session. It got us outside with some distance from the archive and gave us a chance to talk. We've had some really great feedback from our volunteers, and through this work we've also learnt the importance of transferring this research to staff and researcher wellbeing too. The aim behind each of these being to make the Women's Aid Archive as transparent, welcoming and inclusive as possible. So there we have it, a slight whistle-stop tour of some of the ways I'm keeping inclusive cataloguing in mind whilst approaching the Women's Aid Archive. I'm incredibly grateful to the National Archives and Research Libraries UK for the opportunity to think deeper about these subjects alongside my Project Archivist role. Although my fellowship technically ends in February, I know that this is a mindset I'm going to continue for the rest of my Women's Aid contract and beyond. Thank you so much for listening, and please do feel free to contact me if you have any questions or thoughts.